Dear Hannah. She had to listen to her husband Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, who, as her rival wife in the polygamous society of ancient Israel, when husbands had more than one wife, the scriptures say, quote, used to provoke Hannah severely, to irritate Hannah, end quote. Poor Hannah. What about the children? What we are told is that Hannah has borne her husband no children. Hannah is barren. What about other barren women in the Hebrew scriptures? Miraculously, by the power of the Lord, they bear great children. Barren Sarah in her old age bears Isaac. Barren Rebekah eventually bears twins, Jacob and Esau, after Isaac prays for her. Barren Rachel, the favorite of Jacob's two wives, is finally, as Genesis puts it, remembered by God after Jacob has had 10 children. And then she gives birth to Joseph and Benjamin, who become Jacob's favorites. What about these children? Children of once barren mothers in the Bible are always important in the history of salvation. Hannah's story begins in this way. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. Listen to that. Portions to Peninnah and, quote, to all her sons and daughters, end quote. The Elkanahs seem to have been one big happy family. But not so fast. There's some mixed emotions here. Love and generosity mixed with sadness and emptiness. Quote, but to Hannah, Elkanah gave a double portion because he loved her. Because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. So it went year after year, as often as Hannah went up to the house of the Lord. The Elkanahs were a worshiping family, but even as they went up to the house of the Lord, Peninnah used to provoke Hannah. It went on time after time, quote, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. We say for ourselves as we quote Psalm 122, I was glad when they said to me, let us go into the house of the Lord. But it may not have always been a glad time for the maligned Hannah. Imagine that, Peninnah chiding Hannah on the way to church. Imagine Peninnah at worship making Hannah feel like she does not belong there. Imagine Peninnah making Hannah, barren, childless, feel like the Lord had obviously not blessed Hannah the way the Lord had blessed her, Peninnah. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? What about the children? Than 10 sons? Just how many children did Elkanah have with Peninnah? We don't know, but what we do know is that Hannah has no child, not one. What about a child for Hannah? I read in the November 3rd issue of the Christian Century an article by the Reverend Dr. Frank Thomas. The Christian Century, a periodical which I received bi-weekly, began in 1884 as a Disciples of Christ publication called The Christian Oracle. It took on its current name, The Christian Century, around the dawn of the 20th century and widened its denominational scope over time. Dr. Thomas is a professor of homiletics and director of the Academy of Preaching and Celebration. I like that name, Preaching and Celebration, going together, at our Christian Theological Seminary, our Disciples of Christ Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. That school, Christian Theological Seminary, is among the 7 Disciples seminaries and 15 colleges and universities. Higher education has been an important focus for disciples since the beginning of our movement. Throughout our history, disciples have founded institutions of higher learning to educate students and leaders to make a difference in the world. What about the children? The Thanksgiving offering, which we receive this Sunday and next, supports everything from scholarships for students. My daughter Miriam had a scholarship for disciples when she enrolled in our Disciples of Christ College in Hiram, Ohio, to religious offices for them on our campuses, and to their faculty's growth and development. By giving to the Thanksgiving offering, we help our disciples' colleges, universities, and seminaries invest in our young people as they prepare themselves for their future and to be in charge of our future. So as a disciple of Christ, speaking from his Disciples of Christ seminary podium to disciples of Christ, and now a much wider Christian denominational audience, Professor Thomas writes, reflecting on this text and Hannah's story, I remember listening to New Testament scholar Amy Lindemann Allen explain what she called a children's reading of the text. She said, quote, children are very rarely the center of a biblical text and interpretation. Instead, they're usually just an appendage or an afterthought when they're mentioned at all. She made the rather audacious claim that in the U.S. context, when we list different marginalized people and groups, we should include children. Children are often left without voice, and particularly relevant for us as we look at today's Old Testament lesson, children are seldom considered in sermons, theology, homiletics, lectures, papers, articles, lectionaries, and workshops. What about the children? The questions that follow are those that Professor Thomas raises for us today. What about the children? He asks, what about the children in this post-truth era? Fake news, alternative facts, and conspiratorial views of reality present a daily challenge for adults and our sanity. How much more so for children? How should they know what to believe? What about the children? What about the displays of violence, hate, intolerance, and bigotry we adults mimic before them? What are the ramifications of adults acting badly and viciously, even in front of children? What about the children, he asks? In a time when anti-immigrant sentiment is on the rise across the globe, from the United States to Poland, and to more places in the world that I can name, he asks. Preparing this reflection, Professor Thomas says he looked at several lists of the chief challenges facing children worldwide, some of which face children here in our own United States of America. Poverty, life as refugees, violence through indoctrination, lack of access to education, child neglect, child labor, child abuse, rape and molestation, child prostitution, child trafficking and slavery, military use of children, hunger and climate change, to name a few. What about the children? He asks, what if we got busy and active for the children? What do our reflections have to do in 1 Samuel with children this morning? He says Hannah has a word for our commitment to children. Look at the interpretation of the text that puts children at the center. Hannah's completely stressed out. She weeps bitterly. She won't eat. The text says that one day Hannah rose. She went to the temple and there weeps in the bitterness of her soul, saying, God, if only you will give me a son, then I will give him back to you, to serve you all the days of his life. Her lips are moving, but she's not making an audible sound. She's groaning to God quietly from the depth of her soul. Eli, the priest, having first thought that Hannah is inebriated, then answers Hannah and says, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked. After hearing this, Hannah goes on her way, and her face is no longer downcast. What if we had a sacred view of children as the very gifts of God to parents, to adults, to all of us? Professor Thomas asks, rather than seeing them as mere appendages to our perspectives as adults. Do we regard children as sacred in our U.S. context and culture, he asks? Do we regard children outside of our group, ethnicity, or race as sacred? Are immigrant children sacred? What if children were the center of the world instead of adults? What if children were the center of our policies and decisions and behaviors and attitudes of our nation? A recent New York Times editorial argued that the learning catastrophe that has befallen the country's most vulnerable children because of the pandemic will have negative ripple effects for decades to come. How will we prioritize the children who struggle with learning during the pandemic, many of whom were already the most at risk in the most vulnerable communities? How will we ensure that we bring all of our children back to their appropriate grade level? These are concerns which parents have and which concern all of us. What about the adults who refuse to prioritize children enough to affect change across our nation and our world? Do we adults know how sacred children really are? He concludes. The next morning, Hannah and Elkanah go to worship as was their custom, and then come back home. And at home, Hannah conceives, and Hannah gives birth to a son, Samuel. How precious a child is, and how important Samuel will be. Prophet, judge, priest, king maker, and king breaker. I asked the Lord for him, Hannah says. Prayer is answered, and having borne this child she considers sacred. Aren't all children sacred? Hannah gives him back to God as she promised. What about the children? Children are the gift of the Lord to all of us. And this time, Hannah wipes her eyes and turns her prayer into a mother's song of joy over her child. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1 begins, Hannah prayed and said, my heart exalts in the Lord, my strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly, let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. The Lord brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. The Lord brings low, he also exalts. The Lord raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with princes and to inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, the Lord. I want to close this morning with words that were printed in this past week's issue of Time magazine. They're from the late General, Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who chaired and addressed the President's Summit for America's Future in 1997, sponsored by his nonprofit, America's Promise, dedicated to lifting up at-risk youth. What about the children I've asked you today? He answered, this is a time for each and every one of us to look into our own heart, to look into our own community, to find some young person who is in need, find someone who's wanting, find someone who's looking up to us, and for each and every one of us to reach down, to reach back, to reach across, to lift up a fellow American youth and put him or her on the road to success in this wonderful country of ours. May it be so.